Hello, everyone. My name is LJ Stambuk, and I'm the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. Happy New Year to you, to your families, to your closest people. We have a great program today to start 2023. It is a program with Tom Standage, who is the Deputy Editor-in-Chief of the Economist, and he's also the editor of the World Ahead 2023. We had the pleasure last year to have Tom Standage with us. And again, it is a great privilege for us to have Tom with us today. So Tom will talk about the world ahead in 2023. Ready? I would like to use this opportunity to thank the World Affairs Council of Charlotte corporate sponsors. Without your help, we would not be doing what we're doing today and having this conversation. Thank you to Bank of America, Novant Health, Atrium Health, Deloitte, Orvis, PDM, Rogers, Truist, and UNC Charlotte. Maddie. So what do we do? We're the community's premier global education, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and we seek to provide leadership for global thinking. We have a firm belief that each person has a right to fact-based analysis, informed commentary, and innovative explanations of critical global issues, both current and future. By facilitating and encouraging dialogue, knowledge, active participation, understanding of global issues, the Council promotes these ideals as vitally important for our democracy to flourish at all levels. Mary. Now, a couple of housekeeping. If you've been on our Zoom programs before, you know this. Your microphone will be on mute and your camera will be turned off for the duration of the presentation. To submit a question at any time, and we do want you to submit your questions to Tom, please use the question and answer box in the Zoom toolbar. You can see it's circled in red in the middle of the Zoom toolbar. This presentation will be recorded and we will share it via the World Affairs Council mailing list. So please make sure you're signed up to receive our emails. Maddie. Couple of upcoming programs. On January 24th, we have the World Affairs Council Charlotte Ambassador Circle Series with His Excellency Marek Magierowski, the Ambassador of Poland to the United States. On February 8th, we have the Young Professional Great Decision Lecture with Dr. John Cox on war crimes. March 2 to 16, we'll have the World Affairs Council of Charlotte Travel Advantage Program, a journey for the history of Egypt with an extension to Jordan. On March 21st, we have the World Affairs Council CEO Series with Fred Whitfield, who's the president and vice chairman of the NBA Charlotte Hornets. On April 4th, we have the Ambassador Circle Series with Ambassador Eric Rubin, who is a former U.S. Ambassador to Bulgaria, and is the president of the American Foreign Service Association, and he will speak on U.S. diplomacy in the 21st century. May 1st, we'll have the World Affairs Council CEO Series with Dr. Robert Engelhorn, who is CEO of BMW Manufacturing right here close to us in South Carolina. And just to add, we will have His Excellency Santiago Cabanas, Ambassador of Spain to the United States at the beginning of February, and also World Affairs Council Speaker Series with Dr. Michael O'Hanlon, who is a Senior Foreign Policy Fellow at the Brookings Institution. We will add programs and we will keep you informed as we add programs to the spring program list. And if you're on social media, and most of you are, please like, share, and follow the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. We are all social media, and we would like to have you be our partner, our friend, and get your comments through our social media outreach. Thank you. Now, this is important. This is an additional surprise, so please don't miss out on this. From 3 p.m. to 3:30 p.m., we will have an additional 30 minutes of a conversation with Tom Standage offered to all attendees. All you have to do is stay on, and we will have this incredible opportunity to speak for 30 more minutes to Tom after this lecture. I would like to use this opportunity to once again thank Tom for being with us today, but also for agreeing to stay with us and speak with us for an additional 30 minutes after the program. Mary. Most of you know Tom Standage. Most of you follow The Economist. A lot of you have been with us last year when Tom spoke to us. So I will keep it very short. He is the deputy editor of The Economist and editor of its future-gazing annual, The World Ahead. He joined The Economist as science correspondent in 1998 and quickly rose through the ranks, and he is now the deputy chief editor of The Economist. His history books include Writing on the Wall, 2013, The Victorian Internet, 1998, and the New York Times bestsellers, A History of the World in 6 Glasses, 2005, and An Edible History of Humanity, which is fun. All of them are fun, 2009. His latest book, A Brief History of Motion, was published in 2021. And Tom, I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I surely will. And we appreciate all that you're doing and look forward to more of your books coming out in the future. So, Tom Standage, thank you from London.
Thanks very much indeed. Thank you very much for inviting me once again. It's great to be here once again. So here are my, I hope you can see my slides now. So yes, I'm going to take you through my top 10 for 2023. So where does this come from? Well, we have this in the annual that I edit. Here are some past covers of previous editions. We have an editor's letter, and I draw this editor's letter from really across the whole edition, and I try to synthesize all of the opinions and the forecasts and the analysis that have appeared within it. And so I should probably tell you where they come from. So this annual is put together not just by economists, journalists, so not just by my colleagues, the same people who write the weekly, but also by our colleagues at the Economist Intelligence Unit. And so they provide a section in the middle, which gives you forecasts on 15 industries and 80 or so countries. Then we also have external guests in the fields of politics, business, science, and culture who give us their view on what to look out for in the coming year. This year we have, for example, Eric Adams, Mayor of New York City. We have Sal Khan, the founder of Khan Academy. We have Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados. And we have the legendary music producer, Brian Eno. And then we also have the fourth source of predictions and forecasts is the Good Judgment team of super forecasters. And this is the team that won the US government's competition to find the most accurate geopolitical forecasters. And in fact, they held the competition, and the super forecasting team won it. And then they held it again, and they won again, and they kept winning by such big margins that actually the US government stopped having the competition. So they clearly are onto something. They have a very clever method of making these forecasts. And so we're very lucky that they make a handful of forecasts for us each year. And I'm going to be sprinkling those into my remarks as we go along. So what I do in this letter, and there's a new picture of me that is commissioned for it every year. And this year I look quite a lot like Emmanuel Macron for some reason. Draw your own conclusions. But anyway, I boil all of this down into 10 of my most important things to look out for in the coming year. So I'm going to be taking you through, in effect, the live version of this editor's letter right now. So let's jump in, and you won't be surprised to learn that the number one item, the most important, most consequential thing is what happens in Ukraine. So it used to be the case in the last couple of years that the pandemic was the most important thing that was driving world affairs, that was driving the economy, and so on. And now it's definitely the war in Ukraine. And it's because even though it's a conflict within Europe, it has global implications. It affects the prices of energy and food for everyone all over the world. That in turn feeds into inflation. That in turn feeds into interest rates. That in turn means that we have a strong dollar, which affects people around the world. And that in turn means that central banks around the world have been raising interest rates and trying to deal with inflation, because obviously the rising price of food and energy has caused inflation to rise to 40-year highs in much of the world. So really, I think of it like a series of interconnected gears. That Ukraine is this great big gear wheel that drives all of these other things. So really what happens on the ground in Ukraine is enormously consequential for all of these other things, even parts of the world that are far away. So what do we think will happen? Well, we think that there are likely to be some further Ukrainian advances during the year, but probably not on the scale that we saw in the last few months. And we think an end to the conflict is unlikely, essentially because both sides want to keep fighting. Putin cannot win. So what he thinks he can do is do a better job of of fighting this year. He's mobilized more troops, and he's hoping that he can fight back. And Ukraine clearly would like to take back its territory from Russia. So neither side is in the mood to negotiate. And Putin also has an interest in stringing out the conflict for as long as possible, for really sort of slowing it down and freezing it as much as he possibly can. And I think it's no coincidence that if you see images from the battlefield, they are quite reminiscent in some cases of trenches in the First World War. And what Vladimir Putin is hoping for is that if he can stretch this out, then he can benefit from a change in the external environment that will be to his favor. So, for example, he's hoping that he can essentially wear out the Western supporters of Ukraine. They will get bored of supporting Ukraine. They will be unwilling to provide financial support and weapons and so on. And the longer this goes on, the more likely they are to change their minds. And in particular, he's hoping that a cold snap Europe, and we may be about, so far winter in Europe has been actually unseasonably warm, but, that could still change. But in particular, next winter, the end of this year, we could have a very cold winter there. And that could be particularly problematic if we haven't got enough gas. And that's the sort of thing that could potentially start to cause questioning of support for Ukraine within Europe. But the other thing he's hoping will change is the political weather in America, where clearly you have Republicans in charge of the House now, and some of them have already started referring to Volodymyr Zelensky as a welfare queen. And what Vladimir Putin would really like is a Republican president at the end of 2024, ideally Donald Trump, because he knows exactly where Donald Trump stands on Ukraine. And so if he could just keep this going and stretch things out and reduce the intensity of the conflict, then he's hoping that circumstances will change to his advantage. And I think that's why it's important that Western supporters of Ukraine continue to supply weapons and financial support and continue to help Ukraine maintain the momentum, because otherwise Vladimir Putin is going to get what he wants. So as a result, we think a decisive resolution of the conflict is extremely unlikely in 2023. One possibility that is sometimes raised is Putin unwell? Might he be ousted? There seems to be sort of growing tension within the Russian political system. So we asked the super forecasters this specific question, and they put the chances of Putin being ousted this year at 9%, which is not zero, but it's not terribly high. So that's why we think the war is likely to continue. So moving on to the second of my top 10 is the outlook for the economy. We've gone from worrying about spike proteins during the pandemic to worrying about spiking prices and inflation that we're seeing on really unprecedented scale in the last few months. It began as a consequence, a side effect, if you like, of the pandemic towards the end of 2021. And there was a lot of debate about whether it would subside in 2022, how quickly it would subside. But all of that was really made irrelevant by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because that then obviously was a massive shock to energy markets and caused inflation in all sorts of ways. So that means that prices are going to stay higher for longer. Inflation is going to stay higher for longer than would otherwise have been the case. As a result of this, we've seen central banks around the world raising rates, and not just raising rates faster than they have in decades. They're all doing it together. And what we've seen in previous economic shocks is that sometimes you can have Europe does well, but America is doing badly, or vice versa, and they can sort of compensate by exporting to each other, things like that. That's not really an option in this case. It looks as though inflation has peaked in the US now, and it looks like it may have peaked in Britain as well. But central banks are going to be as hawkish as it takes to ensure that inflation is stamped out, and that means they are likely to continue raising rates. And we are, probably not going to see rates starting to come down until the end of this year. And so as a result, we are expecting recessions, probably quite a quick, mild one in the US, possibly a deeper one in Europe, because as well as the post-pandemic inflation that the US faces, Europe faces this energy shock as it tries to wean itself off Russian gas. And that means bringing in LNG, liquefied natural gas from other parts of the world, which is more expensive, and essentially switching to other things, finding other ways to do without gas, some of which cost more money. And then we think there's going to be also a nasty recession in Britain. It may already have begun. It's very hard to tell. But as well as the post-pandemic inflation and the energy shock, we in Britain also have to cope with the after effects of Brexit, which in effect is, it means we've imposed trade sanctions on ourselves. We've cut ourselves off from our largest trade market, our largest partner. And that is, as a result of that, we are going to be recovering not only from the pandemic, but also from this economic shock. It's going to take longer than it otherwise would have done. But the pain is global. It's not just in these developed markets where we're seeing high inflation and high interest rates. Because the US is raising rates, that's resulting in a very strong dollar. And that means that countries elsewhere that have to pay for their imports using dollars or have debts denominated in dollars are also feeling the pain. And we're also seeing, pain because some countries are not getting as much gas as they would otherwise have got. Places like Pakistan, India, Egypt would be another example, either because they're exporting it or because other countries are outbidding them. And so these really are global repercussions in the economy and in energy markets as a result of this invasion of Ukraine. Moving on, though, there is a silver lining, and I am going to have a couple of silver linings. It's not all going to be bad news. So this is the first one. And the first silver lining relates to climate change and energy transition. The war is going to accelerate the switch to renewable energy. In fact, you could even say that the war in Ukraine is the best thing that's ever happened in the fight against climate change. In the immediate short term, many countries have been using more coal as a stopgap measure, and Britain would be one of them, while they ramp up alternative sources. That means ramping up renewables. It also means importing gas. But really, the logical thing to do is to ramp up renewables. It takes a minimum of sort of 18 months, 2 years, and we are going to see some new renewable projects coming online, maybe towards the end of this year. But what we've seen is in Europe, 19 countries have now, in 2022, new records for their use of wind and solar since the war began. And Fatih Birol of the International Energy Agency has called the conflict a turning point in the history of energy that will accelerate the clean energy transition. There's been a record increase in energy investment, and spending on clean energy accounts for about 60% of total spending and almost 3/4 of the growth. So what's happening here is that countries around the world have suddenly got a reason to invest in clean energy infrastructure and renewable energy that is not actually related to climate change. It's because if you invest in renewables that you control, that are on your territory or off your shore, then you have more energy security. And it's also cheaper a lot of the time than the fossil fuel alternatives. So even if you don't think climate change is real, which it definitely is, then you have a reason to invest in renewable energy. And of course, European nations never want to be dependent on Russian gas ever again. And broadly, we're seeing this phenomenon that people who depend on their energy, they depend on importing hydrocarbons from autocratic regimes. They don't want to be in that position anymore. And so there's this much greater emphasis on energy security and self-sufficiency. And that in practice means a lot of investment in energy infrastructure. And of course, if you're investing in energy infrastructure now, you might as well be in renewable infrastructure or something that you can transition. So if you're building liquefied natural gas terminals, for example, ensure that they can handle clean fuels like green hydrogen or ammonia in future. So solar and wind are big beneficiaries here. Nuclear is as well. Vladimir Putin has given politicians cover to make unpopular decisions about keeping nuclear power stations on in Germany, for example. That's good. Not cancelling planned nuclear power stations. And then the other big winner here is hydrogen. And hydrogen has a bit of a bad name because people tried to make cars powered by hydrogen, and that's not a terribly good idea. That's about the last thing you should do with hydrogen. If you are able to produce hydrogen, it has all sorts of interesting uses in decarbonizing industrial processes such as steel making and possibly decarbonizing things like shipping and aviation. And so we're seeing an enormous amount of interest in producing hydrogen and in developing new processes that use it instead of fossil fuels. Now, what's interesting is that there's so much money being thrown at new energy, clean energy infrastructure that we're starting to see arguments between the US and the EU, for example, about whether this is fair. So the US, to give an example, has very generous hydrogen subsidies. It also has $7,500 credit towards electric vehicles, provided they're predominantly made in the US. And European car makers aren't happy about that. And they're saying, well, hang on a minute, if we're Volkswagen and we want to sell you an EV that's made in Europe, or we're Mercedes or somebody like that, then doesn't this violate World Trade Organization rules? So we are seeing concerns that this is sort of industrial policy going too far, and it's sort of protectionism in a new guise. And I think there is some justification to that. But on the other hand, I would say I think this is a high class problem to have, when we're at the stage where we're sort of arguing about just how much money is being thrown at the clean energy transition and at clean energy technology, that's a really good position to be in, because it means we're really building the infrastructure that we need if we're going to manage without fossil fuels in the future. Okay, moving on to number 4. This is about peak China. You may have seen the news today that that the Chinese population shrank last year, according to official figures. And the bigger picture is this, which is that China's population is now shrinking, and India's population is continuing to grow. And India's population will overtake China's sometime this year. The UN reckons in the middle of April. May have actually already happened. We're not quite sure, but this is the year where India becomes the world's most populous nation. And this is, I think, one of the contributing factors into the discussion about whether China's best days are behind it when it comes to rapid growth. Growth has been suppressed by lots of things. It's been suppressed by the aging population, and now by the shrinking population. The workforce in China has actually been shrinking for some time. And if you think about it, the impact of things like the one-child policy was that you had in the 1980s, for example, you might have had one child with 2 working parents. Now you've got one working, one person in the workforce with 2 retired parents, and so the dependency ratio is going up. So in the long that suppresses Chinese growth. But we've also had other factors like chaos in the property market, the crackdown of the government against tech firms and trying to get them to change direction and to focus on technologies that the government thinks is more useful. But obviously the biggest one in the past couple of years has been the zero COVID policy. And this was extremely effective in the early days of the pandemic, but it gradually became more trouble than it was worth in the government's calculation. Because when you shut down entire factories or entire cities, when you just detect a handful of cases, that's incredibly disruptive. And so the government decided right at the end of last year that actually getting rid of the zero COVID policy, and it was no doubt helped along in that decision by the fact that protests were starting to break out against it. So it decided that actually getting rid of it would be painful in the short term, but might actually mean that it would be less disruptive in the long term. So far, and I was just talking to one of my colleagues in China this morning, so far that gamble seems to be paying off. We don't really know how many people have died in this wave. The government says 60,000. Other people are estimating much higher numbers. But what seems to have happened is that in places like Shanghai, pretty much the whole population caught COVID straight away as soon as the policy was lifted. And that means that everybody, got over it in a couple of weeks, those that survived. And that means that they've now got very good herd immunity. And so there were deserted streets from self-imposed lockdowns for a bit, but now economic activity is going again. The traffic is just as bad as it was before the pandemic. And the real question now is how quickly China is going to bounce back. Its GDP figures for last year were extremely disappointing. And it does seem that the government is very, very focused on growth again. And not surprising, because ultimately the compact that the Chinese government has with the Chinese people is you get fewer human rights, but in return you get faster growth and you all get to be more wealthy. And that did seem to be the case for a long time. But this year it looks as though India will probably grow faster than China, and India, of course, is a democracy. And the Chinese promise that you would get this rapid growth and the government would look after you has looked rather tarnished in light of the events of the past year and the incredibly intrusive lockdowns that places like Shanghai had to go through. It was also extremely expensive to maintain the zero COVID policy. So by one estimate, China spent something like 1.5% of GDP, which is $250 billion just on COVID testing during 2022. Because if you're going to test a large city, every 2 or 3 days, then that's an awful lot of tests, and that costs an awful lot of money. So all of this adds up to speculation about whether China's era of rapid catch-up growth might have ended. Obviously, China has been the fastest growing major economy for a long time. It's the number 2 economy in the world, and a lot of people were expecting it eventually to overtake America's, and it was a question of when, not if. And people are now starting to say, well, maybe China's economy will never overtake America's in size. So this is a forecast from Capital Economics. Now, obviously, forecasting GDP for large economies far into the future is an extremely dangerous thing to do. But there is a precedent here, which is that this is what people said about Japan in the 1980s, that it would overtake America's economy, and it never did. So I think there's going to be a lot of discussion, not just about the peak of the population, but about whether China, how quickly is it going to grow this year? when it comes out of COVID? Is there going to be another COVID wave later in the year? Is China going to end up in what economists call a middle income trap, where it grows, modestly, 3 or 4% a year, which would be quite impressive for a developed European country, for example, but it's much slower than China has been growing in recent years. And I think for those of us who are watchers of global affairs, there's a second silver lining here, which is that all of this, I think, has really undermined the idea that the Chinese model is a viable alternative to democratic capitalism. The idea that you can always trade human rights for rapid growth. I think that's something that there's much less evidence for that now. In 2022, certainly, people in China may have felt that they weren't getting a good deal from this. The question, I think, for the rest of the world is: will a slower growing, weaker China be a more dangerous China? And so we'll come back to that in a minute. But first, let's go to America. And clearly, America now has divided government after Republicans took the House in the midterms. But it also, in both the House and the Senate, you have these razor-thin majorities, and that is a recipe for infighting, for empowering factions, and for frankly not getting very much done. So I think we can expect to see conflict both between and within the two parties this year. Republicans are going to launch lots of investigations into Hunter Biden's laptop and that sort of thing. And cultural divides on things like guns and abortion and how you teach race and history in schools show no signs of getting any less deep. So the usual sorts of conflict, I think, between the parties. But what's more interesting is what's happening inside the parties. Donald Trump wants to run again for president. This sets the scene for a bruising primary contest. I think others are watching him run. I think one commentator said he's running against himself and losing. So there's I think anyone who wants to challenge him is going to leave him as long as possible to do that. But there is a question about the influence of the Freedom Caucus in the House, whether that's going to cause problems to the Republicans more broadly. Would Trump run as an independent candidate if he didn't get the nomination? There's all sorts of drama within the Republican Party. And then within the Democratic Party, Joe Biden did much better in the midterms than expected, but he's also under pressure to say that he won't run again. He clearly wants to. Trump and Biden would love to have a rematch of 2020, but they're pretty much the only people who would. Within their parties, both parties would love to move on to a new generation of younger leaders and get past the arguments that we've had for the past few years. And the case is being made to Joe Biden that if he were to say that he wasn't going to run in 2024, that he might find it easier to get things done in his last 2 years in the White House. He'd be potentially able to peel off moderate Republicans and pass bills in some areas if he wasn't the other team's candidate for president next time around. And the areas you can imagine that happening, the two areas where Republicans and Democrats do occasionally agree, is on standing up to China and bashing big technology companies. And you can imagine things happening, bills maybe being passed on those things. And of course, the overlap between those two things, big tech and China, is TikTok. So TikTok has got a big target painted on it right now. Okay, geopolitically, this brings us to flashpoints to watch. Because bashing big tech could raise the temperature of the relationship with China. China does seem to want to reduce the temperature, and it does seem to be being quite conciliatory now. But the thing that everyone is concerned about, of course, is how it will interpret what's going on in Ukraine and what that means for Taiwan. And there's two ways of reading this. On the one hand, China might think, well, America looks quite distracted right now with the war in Ukraine, so now might be a good time to make a move on Taiwan. On the other hand, and we think this is much more likely, the trouble that Russia has run into in Ukraine shows that size isn't everything. And when a big country attacks a smaller country next door, things don't always go according to plan. And of course, Russia actually has a land border with Ukraine, which China doesn't have with Taiwan. It would be much more difficult to mount an assault over the Strait of Taiwan. So we think the chances of shots being fired across the Taiwan Strait are quite low this year. The super forecasters have put it at 1 in 6. And instead, we think it's more likely that if we are going to see anything, it's going to be provocations, and we have seen these in recent weeks. The number of times that Chinese warplanes have been flying through airspace that Taiwan lays claim to, and so forth. We think that sort of thing, testing the mettle of America and its allies in Asia, is more likely. But of course, there are many other flashpoints to watch. And having been caught up by the Ukraine war, we and other observers are suddenly paying a lot more attention to places where conflict could suddenly flare up. Another is the disputed border between India and China in Himalayas. There was a brawl there in which 24 people died in 2020, and in fact we made this prediction last year, and in November, and in December there was another fight there in early December. There's also conflict brewing in Russia's backyard between Armenia and Azerbaijan, because when the cat's away, the mice play. And then closer to home, a controversial but I think worth watching possibility is that Turkey might try to take an island, a Greek island. There are several Greek islands very close to the coast of Turkey, and the temperature, the rhetoric has really been ramping up in the last few weeks there. This is because President Erdogan of Turkey faces an election in mid-2023. It's not looking very good for him. It's going to be the most difficult election of his career. And so he might want to sort of stoke nationalist further, particularly in the year that is the centenary of the founding of the Turkish Republic, by picking a fight with Greece. And the Greeks might be up for a fight as well, because the Greek Prime Minister also faces re-election this year and is not doing terribly well in the polls. So that's a recipe for escalation, which would, of course, be a crisis for Europe, but also a crisis for NATO, because both countries are members. Very quickly, I think a sort of litmus test of how things are going is to look at alliances. Which ones do people want to join, and which ones are not doing so well? And if you look at the scenario in 2023, you've got NATO is clearly an alliance that people want to join. Finland and Sweden want to join, and Turkey basically is naming its price for letting them in. And of course, Ukraine has applied to join the EU, and Ukraine's foreign minister recently pointed out that Ukraine is kind of a de facto member of NATO now, because it's getting so much support from NATO and it's coordinating so closely with NATO. So I think this is the third silver lining of the current situation, which is that there's greater Western unity. There's been a reminder in all of this of why we have things like NATO and the EU, that it's a reminder more broadly that democracy doesn't defend itself. And I think that's a good thing. That said, even though the West is more united than it was, the gap between the West and the rest has got bigger. So most people in the world live in countries that either voted with Russia or abstained in United Nations votes on the situation in Ukraine. So that's kind of worrying. But that said, we are seeing more. We're going to hear more, I think, about these new alliances, such as the Quad, which is the US, India, Japan, and Australia, and AUKUS, which is Australia, the UK, and the US. These are the sorts of up and coming alliances to keep an eye on. There's a question about whether Saudi Arabia might join the Abraham Accords. And meanwhile, on the flip side, the CSTO, which is the Russian alliance with 5 ex-Soviet countries, is not looking in great shape. Armenia is a member of that, but Russia is signally failing to come to its aid in its conflict with Azerbaijan. And I think of all the alliances, the one I'd never heard of, but I think is also a sign of things to come, is called I2U2, which is not a rock band, but a food security and clean energy forum that brings together Israel, India, the UAE, and the US. And that's an interesting group that sort of cuts across geographical and political lines. And I think that shows you how important food security and clean energy are to everybody. Okay, on to travel. One of the things that's going to happen this year is that spending on tourism is going to get back to where it was before the pandemic. And we are calling this revenge tourism. This is where travelers get their revenge on the virus by taking the holidays that they were denied in 2020 and 2021. So like, take that, COVID, I'm going to have 2 holidays this year. International tourist arrivals were up by 60% last year. They're going to be up by another 30% this year. And that will mean that spending gets back to the pre-pandemic level. The actual number of trips will be a bit lower. It's just that each trip will cost a bit more because of inflation. So we're expecting kind of 1.6, 1.7 billion trips as opposed to 1.8 billion in 2019. And the big question here is the extent to which Chinese tourists come back in Asia in particular, because they account for about half of that gap. So there's still unresolved. We don't know how big Chinese foreign tourism is going to be this year, but I would have thought it's going to be quite significant. At the same time, business travel is very weak. because firms are cutting costs, they're tightening their belts as they look at the economic situation. And they've also noticed that actually video conferencing really isn't bad. It's a lot better than it used to be. And if you look at previous crises like 9/11 and the global financial crisis, business travel never got back to its previous level. Tourism did, but business travel never did. This time, I don't think it will either, because we've all got used to using this technology. And so as the beaches and the sun lounges fill up again, this is a case where I think revenge, which we usually talk about serving cold, is best served hot, ideally with a cocktail. Okay, on to the metaverse. Will the idea of working and playing in virtual worlds catch on more widely this year? I think we'll get a good sense of where things are going. And in particular, the thing to watch will be what Apple does. Now, with many cases, many previous markets, with smartphones, with tablet computers, with smartwatches, Apple's entry into the market really changes the game. And they haven't dabbled in this market, and they are going to be launching their first headset this year. And it won't be for consumers. It'll be quite expensive initially so that people can build games and content and other experiences to run on it. And then there'll be a cheaper headset to follow. But it'll be very interesting to see what that does and whether it changes perceptions about what people often call the metaverse. And it will be interesting to see whether Apple uses the word metaverse. I think it's more likely to use a term like mixed reality or extended reality, because I think Facebook renaming itself to Meta has rather tarnished the term metaverse, which has been around for a long time. It's been around since 1992. And lots of other companies, apart from Facebook or Meta, are big believers in this idea of interconnected virtual worlds. But I think a lot of people who aren't familiar with it assume when they hear the word metaverse that it's some sort of new product from Facebook to replace their social networks, which people are losing interest in. So I think it's been very confusing. It's similar. Imagine if Google renamed itself to the cloud. Think of the chaos that would cause. I think it's a bit like that. So we'll see what Apple does and whether Apple's entry into the market makes a difference. And we'll also see whether Meta sticks with its bet on the metaverse as the next big thing, because its share price has not been doing well, and Mark Zuckerberg is under pressure to change direction. Finally, lots of new words we're going to have to learn this year. We've got a roundup of them in the world ahead. We've spent the last few years learning new terms in immunology and vaccinology. In 2020 and 21, we had to learn about flattening the curve and spike proteins and mRNA. In 2022, we had to learn lots of new military terms like HIMARS and counter battery fire. And I think in 2023, there's going to be more military terms, unfortunately, more environmental terms as we see the impact of climate change and extreme weather. So things like Deadpool and resilience hubs. And then, of course, there are always new technological terms. The ones I would keep an eye on are pass keys. And these are a way of replacing passwords with digital keys that you unlock with biometrics. They can't be guessed, forgotten, or stolen. So they basically put an end to phishing attacks, and they make logging into apps and websites much easier. This is supported, it works now, it's supported in the latest versions of products from Apple, Google, and Microsoft. It's an open standard, it's magical when you first see it. And as more people upgrade their software and buy new devices, I hope that becomes very widespread, because that would be a big boost to online security. Another example of online security terminology is post-quantum cryptography. I think large organizations are going to have to start paying attention to that. This is nothing to do with cryptocurrency. This is how you protect your data against the possibility that quantum computers will be able to crack your encryption if they start working in the next few years. And we don't know if they will, but as soon as they do, you'll need to have started upgrading all your software 5 years ago. So you might as well start now. And there are all sorts of other jolly new terms, battery belt and productivity paranoia. We've got 23 of them in our roundup of the lexicon for the vocabulary you need to upgrade your vocabulary this year. Anyway, just to finish up, in retrospect, the pandemic marked the end of a period of relative stability in geopolitics and economics. It's been called a holiday from history. We had a long period of very, very low inflation, very, very cheap money, low interest rates, and actually a lack of conflict between great powers. Today's world is much more unstable. We've got the unpredictability of geopolitics. We've got great power conflict is back. We've got the aftershocks of the pandemic, notably inflation. Stagflation is back in some places. It's like a return to the 1970s then, that we're worrying about nuclear conflict and stagflation again. But we've also got layered on top of that the impact of extreme weather events from climate change, and of course, rapid social and technological change driven by computers and the internet. And all of this means that unpredictability, I'm afraid, is the new normal. There's no getting away from it. But we hope that Reading the World Ahead 2023 will help you face this new reality with confidence. And I wish you the best of luck in navigating the ups and downs of the coming year. Thank you very much for listening. And now let's go to Q&A.
Thank you, Tom. Mike Hawley here, former chair of the World Affairs Council, and we've got a number of questions coming into the queue. Some I'll spare you, like if you would please predict the price of wheat and where the S&P 500 will be at the end of this year. We'll not go there.
That's a bit specific, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think if you could talk a little bit about economics, especially in the European Union, which is sometimes quite a mystery to us here. There's economic consequences that vary from country to country in the EU. Can you talk a little bit about just observations about what the recession might hold in various places in Europe?
Yeah. So we think the recession is it's a sort of different beast from previous recessions. In the US, the recession is, we think, going to be relatively mild because the labor market is so strong and the and household savings are quite strong. And the same is true of the labor market in Europe. But household savings is a bit of a different matter because energy prices are so high. I mean, energy bills have tripled for many consumers in Europe. And so what we're seeing is governments have been stepping in to insulate both companies and households from the impact of much higher energy prices. And spot prices have fallen, but of course we don't pay the spot price. So when you buy your energy from an energy company, you usually have a contract at a certain price, particularly if you're a business, and then that energy company itself is buying usually at a contract price. So unfortunately, the fall in the spot price does not mean that we're suddenly all seeing our energy bills dropping. That's not the case at all. And the difficulty is this, which is that some European economies that are stronger, say Germany's, are in a position to help their industry and their householders much more than other economies that have weaker economies. So other countries that have weaker economies, such as Italy. So, for example, if you're a German car maker, you're getting help from the state in paying your energy bills, but the ability of the Italian state to help its car makers to the same extent, it just can't do that. It hasn't got the fiscal room to do it. And so I think the danger is that if this all goes on for a long time with these high energy prices and gas shortages next winter and this sort of thing, that some countries will be better able to support their companies, their households, protect them from having to lay people off, all this sort of thing, and other countries won't. And that is potentially dangerous because you could then get a crack in European unity behind Ukraine, and you could see some countries saying, "Why are we enduring all of this pain just to support Ukraine? Why can't we start buying Russian gas again? Why are we doing this?" And the person we think who is worth watching on this is Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy, relatively new Prime Minister of Italy, and she's very interesting. We actually tipped her as a person to watch in our World in 2022, and she's at the head of a right-wing coalition. She herself has been very outspoken in favor of supporting Ukraine, but she's in a coalition with two much further right-wing politicians who are essentially apologists for Vladimir Putin. So she could come under pressure in order to keep her job and hold her coalition together, to start sort of saying to Volodymyr Zelensky, maybe it's time you cut a deal and start talking to Putin about exactly how much of Ukraine you're going to give in order to get him to stop invading you, at least for the time being. Because that's what it would be. You can't take any promises from Russia seriously about ceasefires because they've violated them in the past. But that's the difficulty, that you might see this crack in European unity. And if we think that Italy would be the country to watch where you might see that, because the economic conditions, particularly if we have a very, very cold winter, either now or at the end of the year, look very different.
Thank you, Tom. This is kind of a combination question from Steve Huff and Kent Walker with respect to NATO and whether there's any significant chance of an embattled Putin basically causing a direct conflict with NATO, and along the same lines, what the odds are of Sweden and Finland joining NATO this year.
So I don't know whether they'll get the whole process done with Sweden and Finland. It really does depend on Turkey, and it's clear that President Erdogan has a price, and we're not quite sure what it is. It may be. It looks like it might be F-15s, and there's this, or was it F-16? There's basically warplanes from Europe, from America that he wants, and there's talk about doing that deal. So that may be the price. You give me the warplanes, I'll let them in. It's also possible that he will delay this until the election, so that if he does, pick a fight with Greece, for example, that the rest of NATO is sort of has its hands tied because it wants to ensure that Finland and Sweden get to come in. So really, it's all eyes on President Erdogan when it comes to the accession of Sweden and Finland into NATO. The other question was about direct conflict with NATO. I don't think it's very likely that Putin would want to escalate into conflict with NATO because he's already losing against a country that's not even a member of NATO. It's being given what is in effect army surplus. I mean, HIMARS is 1990s technology. It's only now that Germany and Britain are talking about giving Ukraine the latest and greatest tanks. An awful lot of what they've been fighting with is much, much older than that. Some of the weapons that have been given to Ukraine have been limited in what they're able to do. So they haven't been given long-range missiles and so on. So it can't possibly go well for Vladimir Putin if he ends up. There's the joke that that's told about how Russia is fighting NATO, and they have this great list of all their losses, and someone says, and how's NATO doing? And of course, NATO hasn't lost anything yet because it hasn't actually committed anything. This is an amazing deal for the US and for NATO, and this is why the Republicans who are calling Volodymyr Zelensky a welfare queen and saying we shouldn't be sending money and aid to Ukraine because we've got problems at home in America. It's true, there are problems that need to be dealt with at home in America, but this is still an incredible deal because America is able to essentially, it's destroyed something like a half of Russia's military capacity without a single American life lost, and at an absolutely knockdown price because Ukraine is doing all of the fighting. So actually giving weapons and support to Ukraine is an extremely, if you're being brutal about the numbers, it's an extremely cost-effective way for NATO to attrit the capabilities of Russia. So that I don't think Russia would want to pick a fight with NATO proper, because judging by how badly it's doing against a very small country next door, it would not go well. So I don't expect Vladimir Putin to pick that fight. Also, it seems to have been impressed upon him by China and others that using nuclear weapons would be a really terrible idea as well. So that seems unlikely because he would lose, what little tacit support he's getting from other countries as well if he did that. And he wouldn't gain him anything on the battlefield. The use of so-called tactical or battlefield nuclear weapons, he would be violating the nuclear taboo at very little advantage. I mean, a single tactical nuke on the battlefield, if you're lucky, will take out 10 tanks. Do you really want to, violate that taboo, blow up the whole nuclear non-proliferation system? I mean, the reason that Russia is taken seriously as a nuclear as a world power is that it has nuclear weapons, because many other countries have gone along with the non-proliferation treaty and the rules around nuclear weapons and chosen not to build them. As soon as Russia uses a nuke, it'll be, all bets are off. Everyone will say, okay, I'm going to build my own. South Korea will start doing it. Saudi Arabia will start doing it. And that will mean that, relatively speaking, Russia is a less remarkable and powerful country. So, now that said, the big caveat here is I'm giving logical reasons why Vladimir Putin should not attack NATO or use nukes. And the big mistake that I and other analysts made in the run-up to the attack on Ukraine is we thought, surely this won't happen. It would be totally illogical. And of course, Putin is attacking Ukraine not for logical reasons, for ideological reasons, or he's been given bad data, or it's very hard to know what's going on inside his head. So I could be completely wrong because Putin sees the world in a totally different way, or doesn't care about logic. So that's the cognitive bias I have to learn to become more aware of, which is that not everybody looks at the world through the prism of logic.
Thank you, Tom. And so let's shift over to China a bit. So David Johnson and others have asked, essentially, we're in a clash of governance systems, it seems, global governance systems. And President Xi has obviously shored up his autocratic trappings, and then we find this major reversal on COVID. And I guess the question is that will this be a chastening event for President Xi, and are we in effect going back to the time that you mentioned in the 80s with Japan, and we're worried much about nothing?
Well, I think that's the big question for this year. It must be a chastening event because the rhetoric and the propaganda from the Chinese Communist Party for so long was, look, we've kept you safe. Our zero COVID policy has protected you. We are the only country strong enough to stand up to the virus, and so on. And for the first couple of years, that was quite persuasive, and people believed it. But then the Omicron variant meant that the zero COVID policy didn't really work anymore, and so you've seen this sudden reversal. And the virus that they were previously saying was absolutely deadly, was going to kill everybody, they're now saying, oh, it's just a cold. And they hadn't really prepared their health system. The ICUs are all full. And we don't know what the death toll is going to end up being, particularly among the old and vulnerable. But there are some very scary estimates. And to qualify as a COVID death in China now, it's only counted as a death death by COVID if the diagnosis is confirmed using a chest X-ray, which means an awful lot of people are going to be dying of COVID, but not appearing in the official figures. So I think, yes, you need to have a diagnosis of pneumonia, basically, from COVID. And actually, Omicron doesn't really do that, does it? Anyway, so it is chastening, but of course the government's not going to admit that at all. The government is totally going for growth now, and really the big question, and it's the big question not just for China, for the world this year, is how quickly China rebounds and how much it rebounds. And the reopening of China is the biggest economic event of the year, not just for China, but it will determine sort of what global GDP looks like this year, but also it will affect an awful lot of other things. If there is a rapid rebound, which looks possible, that will mean that China's demand for commodities, such as LNG and iron ore and so on, will go up. And that will mean that there is more inflationary pressure in the rest of the world. And it will mean that inflation will be higher for longer elsewhere in the world. Interest rates will have to stay high, and so on. So it's very consequential, not just for China, but for the rest of the world, what happens and how quickly China rebounds. And then the other question is that a lot of companies have looked at the pandemic, and they've looked at the political situation in China, and they've looked at the disruption that the pandemic caused, and there has been this quite rapid process towards decoupling and trying to find other suppliers, building things in other places. Apple is starting to move manufacturing of some of its products to India and Vietnam, for example. By no means, it's a very small fraction, and Apple's most important products are still made in China. It's very, very hard to make the most advanced products anywhere else because China just has the best ecosystem. But that's the other question: the extent to which countries say, well, even if China's coming back and bouncing back, we want to insulate ourselves against the sort of sanctions regime we've seen against Russia. If there is conflict in Taiwan, we do not want to have to cut off. We don't want important things in China that we can't get to. So we need to reduce our dependence on China. And China seems to be working very hard to remind everybody how great it is to do business with China, and it seems to be sort of holding out olive branches all over the place at the moment to talk about this, trying to get foreign investment going again, and so on. So we really don't know how that's going to work out. And I think that is the big sort of the big economic question of this year. What does China's rebound look like, and how does the rest of the world respond?
Thank you. And so we might wrap up with this question. Questions coming from Vikram Kumar, who's the chair of the economics department at Davidson College, and David Lin, who's the head of international programs at Charlotte Country Day. And that is globalization. And you've written a lot about this in the Economist recently. The beggar thy neighbor, return to beggar thy neighbor, zero-sum game. What are the implications for China in such a world? And also, as David Lin asks, what, if any, are the implications for this difficult issue we've got with wealth and economic inequality?
Yeah. So obviously, The Economist, I should state our bias up front. The Economist was founded in 1843 to campaign for free trade, and we are great believers in free trade, the gains from trade, the sort of economic, basics that comparative advantage and all that sort of thing. We think trade is good, but clearly a lot of global supply chains were being run in a way that was extremely lean, extremely just in time, extremely efficient, but extremely brittle and vulnerable. And the pandemic really exposed that. And then also the dependence on China, and now the dependence on Russia means that lots and lots of companies are revisiting this. They're not necessarily going all the way back to we need to be nationally self-sufficient in everything, but they are certainly trying to make their supply chains shorter and fatter. So they're not as lean as they were, and also smarter. So using analytics to try and predict what's happening inside them. So clearly, globalization, on a number of metrics, peaked in the global financial crisis. In fact, that was the point at which, on various measures, it peaked. And clearly, we are going further in that direction. And what's accelerating it now is not just risk aversion and trying to not have these vulnerabilities in supply chains. It's also that governments are saying, we will literally pay you to do stuff in our country. So whether it's building chip factories or batteries or whatever. So we have this sort of green protectionism, and we are very much in two minds about it, because in some ways it's good. This means that finally we're throwing money at climate change. I remember after the global financial crisis and after the pandemic, there was lots of talk about, well, we're going to build back better, we're going to have green recovery programs, and that this is finally an opportunity for governments to move the needle on climate change because the recovery funds will have these green strings attached. That didn't really happen. And what's happened with this crisis, with the war in Ukraine, is that there is actually a geopolitical reason, which is energy security of supply, and so on. And so that really is changing minds in a way that sort of worrying about climate change seems not to have done. So in the sense, that's good, but the danger, of course, is that government funding and industrial policy is inefficient. You'll have duplication of things around the world. This is a gift to Republicans who say this is all welfare for the car industry or whatever. And so we are very worried that this will just be economically inefficient. And what we would like to see is the West and the democratic sort of liberal countries of the world acting as a bloc, and trade to continue to be strong among those countries, even if they do want to break ties with China or Russia or other autocratic nations. But sadly, I don't think that is what we're going to see. I think we are going to see this zero-sum mentality prevailing for quite a while.
Thank you, Tom. And we're going to have an extended period of 30 minutes after this. I'm going to turn it over to Lubomir and send our regards to Zanny Minton-Beddoes, who visited with us many years ago before she was famous. Go ahead, Lubomir.
Thank you so very much, Mike. What a great job you did. And this was brilliant. Thank you, Tom. We learned so much. And again, we're delighted to have you with us. We will move to the second part in a couple of minutes. All you have to do is stay on, and thank you for being with us. If you want to switch on your camera so we can see you, that would be great, so Tom can see you while we have this informal conversation. I'm turning it over now to Rajneesh Bharadwaj, the chairman of the board of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. Raj.
Jay and Mike. Thanks. Looks like there's an echo. Tom, it's a privilege and pleasure to have you with us once again. And with that, given the echo, why don't we segue into our optional Q&A session in a much more intimate setting.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good to see you, and Happy New Year to you. Thank you. So those of you that have the time, please stay with us. You don't have to do anything. You can turn on your mic in your picture, your video, so that we can see you, and we'll continue with the conversation in 30 seconds. Good. Thank you all for being here. If you have a question, please raise your hand or contact Charlotte and Maddie so that we can see that you want to ask a question and continue this conversation with Tom Standage. Again, it would be useful if you can turn your camera on so that we can see you and you can wave your hands. Mike Hawley, now you can have a question. Go ahead.
I got my own question. So, Tom, if you would, give us some impressions about American leadership. Is the world worried? Should we be worried? Where are we in the larger scheme of things?
Well, I know that the sort of mantra of the Biden administration has been America is back. And I think the rest of the world's attitude is, yeah, that's great. You are for now, but who knows what the next person's going to do. So I think that the sort of the lesson of the Trump years was that American policy could change on a dime and in sort of unexpected ways, and the sort of reassuring continuity of American policy, wasn't something that you could count on. Of course, one area where Biden and Trump there has been a great deal of continuity is China. And Biden has not undone any of the measures that Trump put in place there. But on all kinds of other things, obviously there's been a complete 180. Climate being a very prominent example, and so forth. So I think the rest of the world is very much sort of let's play this 4 years at a time now, and it will take quite a lot of it'll take a while before before the idea that sort of American, say, foreign policy at least, has sort of settled down again and is relatively stable from administration to administration.
Thank you.
That's something that we'll have to see it. We'll believe it when we see it.
Well, thank you for your candid opinion about this stuff. We very much appreciate it. Back to you, Lumimir.
Thank you very much. And while we're waiting for others to join us, we have about 40, 50 people now with us. Tom, I'm going to ask you a question about Brazil. Brazil has been in the news currently, lately. What is happening with their economy? Is there a path for them to have the economy grow again? It is one of the major economies in the world and the major economy in Latin America. What is your take on Brazil?
Yeah, we hope that Lula will be able to get things done, but the economy is quite weak. I mean, in theory, the fact that Brazil is a big food exporter should help. I think that the main change that we're very, very glad to see in Brazil concerns the Amazon, because Bolsonaro didn't just sort of ignore rules about preservation of the Amazon. He sort of actively encouraged people to break them, and he defunded the organizations that were supposed to protect it, and so on. And the Amazon is not just of significance to Brazil, but it's of significance to the whole world. And there's this concern that it will reach a tipping point and become a net carbon emitter, and so on. So we're particularly pleased to see that the security of the Amazon and that climate change are going to be taken seriously under the new administration in a way that they weren't under the old one. But it's very, very difficult for Lula to get things done. I think he's created something like 14 new ministries in order to be able to give jobs as ministers to people in various opposition parties in order to cobble together a coalition. But that said, he's an incredibly canny political operator, and if anyone can get things done, then it's him. So more power to his elbow.
David, do you have a question?
I'm curious. Earlier, Tom, you said something about the possibility that slow growth in China might make China more aggressive. You teased that, and then you didn't say anything about it.
Oh, okay. I could absolutely. So obviously, China is very big on reviving growth, and that's what sort of everyone is depending on after some very difficult years. But I was talking to one of my colleagues in China this morning, and he said that in the past China had these list of industries that it was expecting to grow rapidly, and it's not quite clear what that list consists of now. And I think the danger is that if the effort to revive growth doesn't look like it's going very well, that the government might do what governments, or certainly what autocrats in a tricky spot very often do, which is they try to rally the country behind them by picking a fight with somebody else. And so this is an age-old pattern in history. And so you can imagine if things aren't going so well for Xi Jinping, that he might say, okay, well, let's have a fight with with Taiwan or whatever, and you're either with me or against me. So that's the concern, that it makes that when the ascension of China as the world's biggest economy no longer looks inevitable, and when people are starting to question whether this approach that China has taken, which it said was a model for other countries, when people are starting to question that, then what do you do to shore up support for your government. And so that's the kind of thing that we've seen in the past and that we worry we would see again. But I must emphasize that this is not something we expect in 2023, that we think that growth is the priority for this year, and that China is unlikely to make a move on Taiwan.
About this echo, but given the recent elections in different parts of the world, we had the fear of moving to the extreme left or right. Are we returning more to moderation, or is that just a naively optimistic view, Tom?
I would love to say that I agree, and I think you can look at some recent election results, and you can say this does look like a certainly right-wing coalitions that depended. So you got one in America and one in Britain, where you had sort of traditional conservative right-wing parties that formed alliance with sort of much crazier nationalist elements. That doesn't seem to be going so well for either of them, and so that's potentially quite heartening. And instead, we saw Joe Biden winning an election from the centre, and Labour, which is assumed to be the next government in Britain, is also doing well, in part because it's definitely moved to the centre. So it hasn't fallen into the trap that previous Labour leaders have of, well, the reason people aren't voting for us is that we're not left wing enough. Elections, are usually won in the centre, and that sort of law seems to be reasserting itself. That said, this is probably just more liberal wishful thinking from The Economist, right? But democracy has been in retreat for 15 years now. We would love to see attitudes towards democracy and support for democracy come back. And I think the war in Ukraine is a reminder of the value of it. This is a country that is fighting to become a modern European democracy, and those of us who are already living in modern European democracies should not take that for granted and should not be complacent, and should be doing everything we can to help them. So democracy needs to be defended, and I think we've sort of banked the benefits of it and taken it for granted a bit too much in the last 10 years.
I have a question. What will be the impact of the new Israel government, and how will it be felt around the region? This is from an anonymous attendee at this point of time.
Okay, I have to say I'm not an expert on this, but what I think is interesting about this is the way that the sands are shifting in the Middle East. So the Abraham Accords and the rapprochement that we've seen between Israel and several Arab states is very interesting. And so the question is, will we go further down that path? And Saudi Arabia seems to have been biting its tongue not to be too critical. It wants to invest in Israeli startups. So that's very interesting. And there's question about whether it might join the Abraham Accords. So I suppose the litmus test is what this government does rather than what it says, because a lot of what it says is really quite extreme. But we should judge it on what it actually does.
Thank you, Tom. We have another anonymous attendee. Is he or she are asking, I believe Tom said he's predicting that the Russia-Ukrainian war will go on for quite some time. Could you please comment, or can he please comment on how this war prolonging has benefited the US, Western Europe defense industry? For example, have there been some interesting new weapons being tested successfully? Have there been more jobs in the defense industry created, etc.?
I'm not sure about the jobs, because a lot of what's been said is that Ukraine has got through an enormous amount of weapons, and so stockpiles have been run down in Europe and in America, and actually replenishing them, well, it does require ramping up of some production. So that does mean some jobs. But I think there are a few interesting things to come out of this. The first is that Ukraine, for the most part, is not using the most advanced weaponry. So HIMARS is sort of 1990s technology, where you have the GPS guided medium range artillery rounds. What's really amazing is what the Ukrainians have been coming up with themselves. The innovation on the battlefield with drones, the way that both sides are using drones. This is the first war where drones have played a significant role, and this is stuff that the Ukrainian army have got. They've got these sort of drone units, and they've recruited hackers and computer experts to put these things together. They're getting an amazing amount of intelligence. They're using these essentially off-the-shelf consumer drones to do all sorts of extraordinary things, and that really is remarkable. And it shows you. I mean, you quite often see that you'll be told the cost of something that they've built. Some of these drones, they just fly them into targets, for example. The cost of doing this is much less than expensive weapon systems. And if you listen to people who talk about the theory of war and where it's going, they talk about how it's going towards swarms of disposable sort of low-cost items rather than these extremely expensive fighter jets and submarines and so on. And Ukraine, you can just see that happening in front of you. The other interesting thing about it has been the way Starlink, the SpaceX satellite constellation, has become absolutely central to the war. And this is where I would, because I'm not quite sure whether the question is saying, this is a bonanza for Western arms companies. It may be that it is, but one of the things I'm very struck by is that SpaceX is subsidizing the use of the Starlink constellation by at least some of the Starlink receivers in Ukraine. It's donated them. I can't understand why the US government is not reimbursing them for that, because it's a tiny amount of money and nobody expects Lockheed Martin to donate missiles out of charity, but for some reason Starlink is expected to donate internet service. And the reason I'm a bit worried about that is that I mentioned earlier about the unpredictability of one man, of Vladimir Putin. Similarly, in China, you've got the unpredictability of Xi Jinping. He can turn on a dime with his zero COVID policy whenever he likes, because it's entirely up to him. Another person who's very unpredictable and wields an enormous amount of power is Elon Musk. And if he wanted to unplug Starlink and deny access in Ukraine to Starlink, that would have a devastating impact on the Ukrainian war effort. And don't take my word for it. This is what they've told our reporters, that Starlink is their oxygen, and they use it to do all sorts of things, from sending out Volodymyr Zelensky's evening addresses to connecting drones to the internet to figure out where Russian positions are so they can hit them with artillery and so on. So yes, there's some amazing new technology that's on show, but it's actually not the expensive stuff that the usual suspects, the usual arms manufacturers make. It's consumer drones from DJI, and it's Starlink from SpaceX, and it's essentially this sort of hacked together smartphone technology that's really making a big difference as well. Not to undermine the contribution of things like HIMARS, but that's what's really amazing, that we are watching the future of war unfolding before our eyes, and everybody is agog at the speed at which this is changing.
Absolutely. Again, if you have questions, please send us a question and answer if you're not raising your hand. I see Mike Hawley. Thank you, Mike. Go ahead.
Yeah, Tom, Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, was in Charlotte last week, I think on his way to Davos. But he seemed particularly relaxed about the recent turn of cryptocurrencies, and more comfortable. I suspect that the traditional finance industry as we know it will likely survive for some period of time. And I wondered what the Economist is thinking about those issues, the structure of traditional finance, and also some of the developments which undoubtedly are going to change the world we live in, and possibly the dollar's position as a reserve currency.
Yeah, so we've always been quite skeptical about cryptocurrencies, because one of the uses of for something to be money, it needs to be what? A unit of exchange, means of exchange, unit of account, and a store of value. And crypto fails on all three, so it's terrible as money. And we've always thought that. It goes up and down. There isn't a use case for it. It's been around since 2009, and there's really nothing you can do with it except speculate. But it's worse than just being a giant casino, because at least in a casino, the odds are stacked against you. But this is like a casino where even if you win, the house may just steal all your money and run away to the Bahamas. So we have always been quite skeptical about this. That said, when it comes to the sort of structure of the finance industry, we've always seen this as a three-way fight. So you've got the old traditional way of doing things, the old traditional incumbent banks. You've got the fintechs and the tech companies. And then you've got the crypto crowd who say, no, everything should be decentralized or on a blockchain or whatever. they've kind of gone quiet, and I don't think they're going to be taken very seriously for ever again, maybe, but certainly not for a long time. And so instead, what you've got is the incumbents, and you've got the fintechs, and I think this is definitely for new entrants that were taking a kind of a new entrant through the fintech route. So what you see with, say, the super apps in Europe, in Asia, lots of other companies in other parts of the world want to do the equivalent of super apps, or want to move into financial services, moving adjacent from their industry into financial services. And I think we're going to hear more about that. But the other big thing that we're keeping an eye on is actually what governments do with central bank digital currencies. And the big thing to watch out for this year, and we have a piece about this in the world ahead, is what China does with its CBDC. So this is not a cryptocurrency, and it doesn't even have to use a blockchain. It can do. There are ways you can build a CBDC that use a blockchain, but why you'd want to do that, I just don't know, because it's just a currency where it's issued by the central bank, and everyone has an account at the central bank. So just do it the old-fashioned way with a database, for God's sake. But anyway, what the CBDCs are interesting because they would grant central banks various sort of superpowers. But what's interesting is that China has been rolling its out within its borders, and it's got about 150 million users of it now. It was testing it with foreign visitors during the Winter Olympics. But I think the big question is whether China starts to try to use its CBDC for settlement of trade payments. And if it does, so you have the sort of digital Belt and Road idea where China's allies and the countries that it trades a lot with, it starts to expect them to use its e-yuan or the eCNY as it's known, for trade settlement, and that would be potentially quite interesting. They are sort of preparing the plumbing for being able to do this and being able to use this currency abroad already, and we don't know where that's going. But that's the thing I would keep an eye on, because that's what people are very interested in, the potential of these central bank digital currencies to really change the game about how we think about money generally, but also how we think about reserve currencies. So that's the thing I would be watching closely.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Question, you touched upon India. People want to know more about, a little bit more deeper about where India is heading, the economy, and the relationship with China and Russia and so on.
So we're quite bullish on India at the moment. It's growing very fast. It's going to be the fastest growing big economy in the world this year. And although we don't agree with a lot of the policies of the government when it comes to Hindu nationalism, it does seem to be doing everything right on the economy. And I was in India a few weeks ago, and the general consensus of the business people I spoke to was that they weren't quite sure where it was coming from, but the government answers their calls, and it's possible to actually get things done. And so that must be contributing to the growth. And there's all sorts of interesting new opportunities for India as well. It's got the most solar potential in the world and a big steel industry. So it's very big on green hydrogen, and that may be a big new industry, electrolyzers and green hydrogen for India. So there's lots of opportunities. It's got this demographic dividend kicking in, becomes the biggest, most populous nation in the world this year, but it still has a very young population and a growing population. So if it can harness that population by getting people into the formal economy, then it starts to look, more and more like a superpower. So yes, we are optimistic about India's prospects at the moment.
Thank you. Nora Linton Beck is asking, would love to hear Tom's comment, if any, on the influence of China versus US versus Russia in Africa. Has China overtaken everyone else in being the dominant superpower in Africa?
So we did a piece about this last year, actually, because there was there's a regular conference, I think it's every 5 or 10 years, where China sort of has a big meeting in Africa, and lots of African heads of state go to it, and China says, look how much money we're giving you, and look at all these wonderful things that we're funding, and so on. I think a lot of and this sort of goes back to India as well. There are a lot of countries that don't want to have to pick a side between China and America. And they would really like to play both sides, and take some things from one country and some things from another. There's increasing questions about whether India is sort of moving into the West's camp, and the way that people I've spoken to about this, they say no, India does what is in India's best interest, but sometimes what's in India's best interest also aligns with what the West would like it to do. So this doesn't mean that it's necessarily aligning more with the West, it's just sort of moving in that direction. But I think for smaller countries in Africa, they don't have that sort of geopolitical clout. and so they have to sort of try to play both sides. And I think one of the questions is whether if China is looking weaker and the Chinese model is looking discredited, does that provide an opening for other countries to say, actually, rather than doing things the Chinese way and taking lots of Chinese funding and voting with China in the UN, maybe we can peel off some of these countries and get them to move them into the West side of things. So I think that's an open question, and I think the state of China, and if China is weaker and growing more slowly, that may reduce its influence in Africa and in other places where it has previously been a very big investor.
Yeah, that was actually a question from Rahul. I'm sorry, I misdirected the question. Nora Lindbeck is asking, back to Brazil, with elections close, how much can foreign influence affect the way people accept the new government? And is there anything that can be done to reduce such negative influences? I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's good. Well, I mean, I think I think we are going to see, as with the Trump Republicans, the Bolsonaristas, or whatever they're called, his supporters they are clearly an enduring and important political bloc, and they are going to continue saying that the election was stolen, and they're going to make it difficult to get things done. So it is very much a replay, I think, of what we've seen in the US. And in fact, there are questions about the extent to which there are direct connections between Steve Bannon and people like that, and the extent to which Bolsonaro used the Trump playbook. I mean, he was very much, styling himself the Trump of the tropics. He was starting his own rhetoric about the election was going to be stolen if I don't win it, before the election, and then he duly lost it. And then he ran away to Florida so that he's conveniently in a different country when his supporters, went into the Supreme Court and everything in January the 8th. So we don't know. I don't know. I think there may be more to come out of that. But whatever turns out to be the case of the sort of connections between the Trump camp and the Bolsonaro camp, I think what is true is that Brazil is very divided, and the supporters of Bolsonaro are an important bloc that he or someone else will be able to take advantage of, and the support for him and the belief in the sorts of things that he believed and wanted to do, as with Trump, is still a sizable chunk of the country, and so that's for people who disagree with that view of the world, that's the challenge. How do you stop people going down that sort of path of paranoia? And I think that's a problem that's much wider than just the US and Brazil.
I have a question right back in what's happening in Great Britain. Several commentators have suggested that Vladimir Putin was the main beneficiary of Brexit. Have your analysts looked into whether the FSB played a role in skewing the vote?
Well, I'm not sure if he was. There has been repeated suggestions that he intervened he funded indirectly, the Leave campaign and so on. So it depends what you mean by beneficiary. I don't think he's been a financial beneficiary of it, but Putin's aim has always been to basically sow as much division as possible in the West. And there are various ways you can do that. And if he was in fact responsible for Britain voting for Brexit, and if he did decisively help Trump, and we can't ever really prove either of those things, but if he did, then he got very lucky, because I think his aim was more to sow division than to actually alter the outcome. But in those cases, it's there are people who say that he altered the outcome. I just don't know how you'd prove that. The counterfactual is I just don't know how you'd show it. But yes, I mean you can see why he would want Britain to be out you can see how that works for Vladimir Putin. But there are lots of things that happen in the world that he would approve of. That doesn't necessarily mean that he's behind them.
We have 5 more minutes, so if you have a question, please send it into question and answers now as possible. Question on Iran: what is happening? The demonstrations, will that affect the stability of the government? Is their economy tanking?
Yeah, this is a very difficult one to call, because autocracies look impregnable until they crack. And we can't see, in the case of Iran, we just can't see a middle way between a brutal kind of Tiananmen style crackdown and the collapse of the government. And in fact, we've been doing some forecasting on this and trying to sort of figure out what we think. And there have been the baseline for this is that there have been large scale protests in Iran before, many times, the Green Revolution and so on, and the government has withstood them. On the other side of the ledger, lots of Iran watchers have said they have not seen anything like this since the fall of the Shah. And so you really can read it both ways. And so it's, I wouldn't dare make a prediction about whether the government survives or falls. Presumably the Islamic Republic will come to an end at some point, but I wouldn't like to hazard a guess as to when. That's a really, really difficult one to call. But and even the people closest to it, just don't know.
Do you follow their economy? Do you have any views on how their economy is doing?
Well, I mean, other than the fact that it's been subject to sanctions for a long time, and that the JCPOA was meant to be about you play nice with the nukes and we'll start letting you sell oil again, and obviously that came to an end. So the economy is clearly would be doing a lot better if it weren't for all of those sanctions. So but as to the detail of it, I don't know exactly what's going on right now.
I have one interesting question here, and then Mike, you will have the last question because you did such a great job moderating the initial program. So be prepared for that question. The question is, how will the continual relation of work from home impact how cities develop and how Western public transit systems have to evolve?
Yeah, really good question. So there's something called a donut city, and this is something that a couple of economists, one of whom now works at the Economist, actually came up with. And what they found was, through analysis of sort of house prices and activity, is that the center of cities is a less desirable place to be, and real estate prices for offices are down, and instead people want to be in the suburbs because, and in fact that's where property is more valuable. You get more space, and if you can work from home, then you might put up with a longer commute a couple of days a week in return for more space the rest of the time. So this really does mean that city centres are going to be less business focused in the future. Maybe that means in the future we're going to get more accommodation there, more entertainment, more things like that. But what this means for public transport is that the sort of assumptions that we've had for the way public transport systems work are really called into question. And a lot of people are working Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday in the office, for example. So what do you do about that? Does it make sense, for example, to offer discounted fares on public transport on Mondays and Fridays to try and encourage some people to use those systems, because those systems are running anyway, right? If you're still going to run the trains anyway, then you might as well have people on them. So there's sort of new models that we might have to call into question. The other thing is that some forms of public transport infrastructure that use rails are very, very hard to reconfigure. And this is a reminder of how great buses are, because you can turn buses on and off very easily and you can reroute them. The trouble is, a lot of cities don't do that. They go for decades between replanning of their bus route systems. And the fact is that cities evolve and change a lot faster than that. I think the city of Dallas just a couple of years ago completely re-engineered its bus system. It looked at where people actually wanted to go from to, not where they used to want to go from and to in the 1960s. It's got a much better system. And most people, in fact, in America now commute from one suburb to another, not from a suburb to a downtown district. So these things were changing anyway, but the pandemic has sort of called a lot of assumptions into question. And now is the time to revisit how we think about cities and urban planning, and also how we think about public transport.
Thank you,
And
Mike. You're going to finish. It's your last question is yours, and you're going to close the program. Go ahead.
Well, I'm going to ask Tom a question, and then I'll close it out before he answers. How's that? And Tom, I guess one thing that we would love to hear from you is what should we be thinking about that we're likely not thinking about? What issue out there should get more attention than it's currently getting? And I'm going to say hello to Wayne Cooper. Good to see you, Wayne. Wayne is the immediate past chair of the World Affairs Council. And as he would say, if you're not a member of the World Affairs Council, please sign up to be one. And if you're not a subscriber to The Economist, please, by all means, sign up. It's the best money you'll ever spend. And with that, Tom, we're going to turn it over to you to close it out with an interesting answer.
So the one thing I would highlight, and people talked about the pandemic. There was going to be a pandemic. They called it Disease X, and that turned out to be true. So I think people are worried about what the next one will be, but we've got the tools to respond, I think, a lot more quickly. Climate change was the other thing that people weren't paying enough attention to. I think there's more going on there. The one that I think gets left out, that is a particular cause célèbre for me, is antibiotic resistance. And we are not doing enough to develop new antibiotics, and the bugs are evolving to become resistant, so that the old antibiotics don't kill them. There's a massive market failure here, because if you do develop a new antibiotic, you're not allowed to sell it or use it, because it will be put on a shelf for future use. And so there have been various ways to try and get around this, but we're seeing this now. We've got this triple-demic of COVID and RSV and flu happening at the same time. And my wife, who's a doctor, was saying that lots of people came in and asked for antibiotics to fight the flu. Of course, antibiotics don't work against the flu because it's a virus. And then the following week, they all came back to the doctor to complain that the antibiotics hadn't worked and they still had the flu. And the doctors were like, well, yes, that's because antibiotics don't work against the flu. And this is exactly the kind of behavior that means that antibiotics are going to be less effective in the future, and why we need to develop more of them. So that's the thing I would flag up if I had to.
So my wife is a doctor as well, so at least in your household and ours, that is an absolute big issue. So Ludmir, back to you.
All I have to say is that we value this partnership with the Economist. We hope that you'll be able to join us next year. Yes, please subscribe to the Economist, and yes, please support the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. See you at our next program. Thank you all. Have a great day. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Tom.
everyone.